The corridor outside the nursery was quiet, but the door stood ajar by a few inches. Guards closed it every night. He stopped, checked the hinge, then the camera dome above dark. On the floor, a foam crown lay face down, clean except for one damp edge. He waited, listening, protocol ticking in his head. Then the iPad screen lit itself and the photo appeared. The guard stood with his shoulder angled toward the nursery corridor, posture relaxed enough to look incidental. The palace at night had a specific quiet, thick, controlled, padded by carpets and centuries of habit. Lights were dimmed to their night setting, warm pools along the walls, shadows filling the rest. Nothing should have changed between the last patrol and this one, yet the door had been open. He checked his watch without raising it too obviously. Time matched the patrol log. He had passed this point 37 minutes earlier. At that time, the door had been closed, seal aligned, latch seated. He remembered because he always checked it twice. Tonight, it sat open the width of 2 fingers. He reached out and nudged it shut with the edge of his glove. The hinge made no sound. That was expected. The latch clicked softly into place. Also expected. What wasn't expected was the absence of resistance, no slight pressure from the magnetic seal re-engaging. He pressed again, firmer. Nothing. He didn't enter. That would require a logged reason. Instead, he turned his head slightly, eyes lifting to the camera dome in the corner of the ceiling. The small red indicator light was dark. That alone would have justified escalation. But escalation meant attention, and attention inside the palace moved in predictable patterns. He needed to be precise before he triggered them. He resumed walking, boots silent on the runner, counting his steps until he reached the service alcove at the end of the hall. There, partially concealed by a tapestry, was a maintenance panel. He opened it with his access key and pulled out the tablet assigned to night supervisors. The interface loaded slowly, the way it always did on the internal network. He navigated to access control, filtered by location, then time. The nursery door appeared as a green line, secure, no breach, no manual override. He narrowed the window, still nothing. He checked again, slower this time. There were no missing entries, that was the problem. A door could be forced. A seal could fail. Both would generate noise somewhere in the system. But a door opened, closed, and reopened without a record meant someone with credentials had passed through, or someone had deliberately ensured there would be no record at all. He locked the tablet and slid it back into the panel. His breath fogged faintly in the cooler air near the stone wall. Climate control shifted after midnight to protect the older wings. He adjusted his gloves, not because he was cold, but because the motion gave him time to think. Protocol dictated immediate reporting of camera failure in a protected zone. It also dictated that anomalies be handled through the chain, not independently. He knew who would receive that report. He also knew how quickly it would be softened into a technical issue, deferred until morning. He walked back toward the nursery, stopping short of the door. He listened. Inside, there was only the low hum of ventilation and the faint, irregular sound of a child breathing in sleep. Normal, reassuring, not enough. He crouched, eyes scanning the carpet. Near the baseboard, half under the radiator cover, lay a small foam crown, one of the daytime toys. It shouldn't have been there. Toys were cleared before night cycle. He noted the damp edge, darker than the rest, as if it had been handled recently. Footsteps echoed at the far end of the corridor. Adult, unhurried. He straightened as a senior household officer came into view, expression neutral, eyes already flicking to the closed door. "Everything all right?" the officer asked quietly. "Yes," the guard said, after a fraction of a second too long. "I'm just completing my round." The officer nodded, but didn't move on immediately. His gaze lingered on the camera dome, then returned to the guard's face. "Log it in the morning," he said. "Not a suggestion. No need to wake anyone." The officer walked away. The pressure was subtle, practiced. The guard remained still until the footsteps faded. He looked back at the door, then down at the toy. He did not pick it up. Instead, he memorized exactly where it lay. He waited a full 60 seconds after the footsteps faded before moving again, long enough for the corridor to settle back into its baseline quiet, long enough for the decision to finish forming. He retrieved the toy first. Not with bare hands. He used a clean cloth from his kit, pinching the foam crown carefully, preserving its position in his mind before lifting it. The damp edge was cool, not yet dried. Recent then. He placed it inside a small evidence sleeve normally reserved for lost property and wrote the location and time in block letters. He did not assign a reference number. That would create a trail. At the nursery door, he keyed in his access code and entered. The room was dim, lit only by a shaded lamp near the far wall. Curtains were half drawn. The air smelled faintly of lavender cleaner and warm fabric. He stayed close to the perimeter, careful not to cross into the child's immediate space. The bed was undisturbed. No signs of distress. The child slept on her side, one hand curled near her face, breathing steady. He scanned for anything else out of place. A chair angled slightly differently. A book not fully returned to the shelf. Small things, easy to dismiss individually. Together, they formed a pattern that resisted dismissal. He checked the secondary camera inside the room. That indicator light was dark as well. He exited and secured the door behind him, this time feeling the seal engage after a manual reset. Someone had disengaged it earlier, someone who knew how. At the end of the corridor, he logged into the maintenance terminal, not the security interface but the building system's layer beneath it. Access here was more limited. He had it because his post required redundancy awareness. He filtered for power interruptions, device restarts, manual overrides. A narrow spike appeared at 22:41, 90 seconds long, localized to the nursery wing. He saved the data to an encrypted drive and removed it. Still, no alert had been generated. That meant the override had been masked at a higher level. His radio crackled softly, a routine status check from the night supervisor. He answered calmly, voice steady, confirming position and condition. No anomalies reported. That was true in the narrowest, most dangerous sense. Pressure came in the form of silence. No further inquiries, no follow-up, a clear expectation that the matter would dissolve by morning. He returned to his patrol, but his route tightened, orbiting the nursery wing more frequently than schedule required. Each pass was casual on the surface, precise underneath. He noted staff movements, recorded badge colors, watched hands instead of faces. At 0112, a cleaner approached the corridor with her cart. She stopped when she saw him, hesitated, then asked if she should come back later. He told her to proceed elsewhere. Her relief was immediate, too immediate. He noted it and let her go. At 0147, he made a choice that would be difficult to explain later. He initiated a shadow log, an unofficial record kept only in his personal notebook, time-stamped, factual, stripped of commentary, door status, camera status, staff interactions, no conclusions. By 0210, the weight of it had settled fully. This was not a technical issue. It was not carelessness. It was intent cushioned by authority. He stood once more outside the nursery door, listening to the steady, untroubled breathing inside. His jaw tightened, not in anger but in resolve. Protocol offered clarity until it didn't. At that point, duty narrowed. He closed the notebook and slid it into his jacket. When morning came, he would be expected to forget the night, to log the door as resolved, to accept the explanation prepared for him. He already knew he would not. The next step would require placing the evidence where it could no longer be buried. That meant choosing who to show it to, and when. He adjusted his stance, eyes forward, expression neutral. To anyone watching, he was simply a guard on duty. Inside, the sequence had already changed. Morning light entered the palace reluctantly, filtered through high windows and heavy drapery. It softened the stone but revealed nothing new. The guard finished his overnight duty without incident, handed over to the day shift, and left the corridor exactly as protocol required. Clean, quiet, apparently normal. He did not go off duty. Instead, he changed into his administrative uniform and reported to the technical annex beneath the east wing. The space was narrow and functional, built into the older structure without ornament. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Screens lined one wall, each displaying segments of the palace's internal systems. This was where explanations were manufactured. He signed in using his secondary clearance, the one tied to incident review. It granted read-only access, enough to see, not enough to interfere. That distinction mattered. He located the nursery wing cameras and pulled their status history. The interface showed a brief interruption during the night, already labeled as a power fluctuation. The note had been added less than an hour earlier. The timing was deliberate. Someone had moved quickly. He expanded the data layer beneath the label. Voltage levels had not dropped. No surge, no dip. The cameras had been taken offline cleanly, command issued, then restored. The action required both physical proximity and system authorization. He saved the raw data to his drive, tagging it with timestamps and device ID. Identifiers, again no reference number, again no alert. A door opened behind him. He didn't turn immediately. He waited until the reflection in the screen confirmed who it was. The technical supervisor stood a few steps back, holding a tablet, expression professionally neutral. A man accustomed to solving problems by narrowing them. Looking into last night, the supervisor asked. Yes, the guard replied. He did not elaborate. The supervisor stepped closer, glanced at the screen, then nodded once. Already addressed. Minor system issue. Logged and closed. The words were calm. The implication was not. The guard minimized the window. Which system failed? Legacy interface conflict, the supervisor said smoothly. It happens in the older wings. It didn't trigger a fault code, the guard said. A pause fractional measured. No, the supervisor agreed, because it wasn't a fault. The supervisor met his eyes then, not challenging, evaluating. This wing has enough scrutiny, he continued. We don't need to invent more, especially not over a child's camera feed going dark for 90 seconds. The guard inclined his head slightly, acknowledgement without agreement. 93, he said. The supervisor's mouth tightened just enough to notice. You should let this rest, he said. These systems are layered. You're seeing fragments without context. The guard stood. Context is why I'm here. The supervisor lowered his voice. Context is why you shouldn't be. They stood in silence, the hum of equipment filling the space between them. Around them, the palace continued its morning routines. Staff moved. Doors opened. Normality reasserted itself with practiced ease. The supervisor stepped back. I'll note that you reviewed the logs, he said. Nothing more. The guard watched him leave, the door closing softly behind him. The record would show compliance. It would not show what he had already copied. He removed the drive and secured it. The data alone was not enough. Data could be explained, reframed, dismissed. He needed linkage, proof that intent had crossed from system to space. As he logged out, a maintenance alert flickered briefly on a neighboring screen. Access badge audit, nursery wing, restricted list. He memorized the timestamp. Pressure did not arrive as threat or command. It arrived as an expectation that he would stop looking, that he would accept the version offered. He didn't. He left the annex and stepped back into the daylight corridors, the palace brighter now, more visible, and paradoxically more concealed. The cameras were back online, the doors logged as secure. Whatever had happened had been neatly sealed, which meant someone believed it was finished. It was. The guard took the long route back to the residential wing, passing through public corridors where tourists would arrive later in the day. Sunlight pooled on polished floors. The palace wore its openness convincingly. He adjusted his pace to match the flow of staff, neither hurried nor idle, his attention fixed on patterns rather than faces. He reached a service junction and paused beside the wall-mounted reader used for badge diagnostics. It was an auxiliary unit, meant for quick checks when credentials failed. He keyed in a maintenance request and waited as the system populated the most recent access set for the nursery wing. 3 names appeared. 2 were expected: night nurse, duty officer. The third belonged to no scheduled role in that corridor after 21:00. He did not copy it immediately. Instead, he checked the authorization tier attached to the badge. It was high enough to disable cameras, high enough to suppress alerts, high enough to ensure explanations would be accepted without scrutiny. He closed the screen and continued walking. In the residential wing, activity had increased. Footsteps overlapped. Voices carried softly. The day had begun to layer itself over the night, burying it. He took up position outside the nursery as if resuming routine, posture neutral, gaze unfixed. A senior aide approached from the far end, carrying a folder pressed tight to her side. She slowed when she saw him, eyes flicking to the door, then back to his face. "Everything quiet?" she asked. "Yes," he replied. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "There was a technical note circulated," she said. "You don't need to concern yourself with it." He said nothing. Her grip tightened on the folder. "We rely on discretion," she added, "especially where children are involved." He inclined his head again. "Of course." She moved on, heels clicking softly, already absorbed back into the rhythm of the palace. The message had been delivered, the expectation reinforced. At 10:17, the nursery door opened and the child's nurse stepped out, smiling faintly as she spoke to someone inside. The child's voice followed, clear, calm, no distress. The guard did not relax. Absence of harm did not negate exposure. When the door closed again, he checked the camera end. Icator red light steady, live feed restored, too perfect. He waited until the corridor cleared, then keyed a brief request into his radio, routine equipment verification. It granted him access to the internal monitor for 30 seconds. He used 22. The camera feed showed the room from its standard angle. Bed, window, shelves, everything in place. Then, as the feed buffered, a single frame flashed out of sequence. A blurred shape near the doorway, an adult silhouette partially cropped, a hand low guiding something smaller. The feed corrected itself immediately. Normality returned. He ended the check. That frame should not have existed. It was residue, an artifact left behind by a system that had been interrupted and restarted too cleanly. Someone had missed it. He wrote the time down later alone in the same block handwriting as before. No adjectives, no speculation. By midday the narrative had settled. Technical glitch. Logged, closed. The palace moved on with practiced efficiency. Meetings convened, tour resumed. The child laughed somewhere behind the walls. The guard remained at his post. He now had 3 elements: the unlogged door, the disabled cameras, and a badge that did not belong in that corridor. Separately, each could be dismissed. Together, they formed a line that led somewhere uncomfortable. He knew where protocol would direct him next, and where it would stop him. The next step would require removing the matter from systems designed to protect themselves. It would require placing the evidence before someone whose authority could not be quietly overridden. He looked once more at the nursery door, then away. Timing would matter, so would presentation. And once he crossed that line, there would be no quiet way back. The guard did not request access to the nursery again. That would have been noted. Instead, he waited for the moment when access appeared incidental. It came shortly after lunch, during a routine shift overlap when staff rotations briefly crowded the corridor. He stood back as the child's nurse exited with the iPad tucked under her arm, speaking quietly to another aide. The device was common enough, used for approved educational programs, tightly restricted, content filtered through palace systems. As the nurse turned, the iPad slipped slightly in her grasp. The guard reacted on instinct, steadying it before it could fall. "Thank you," she said, surprised. Her grip tightened again, but she did not immediately move on. "It powered itself on last night," the guard said, carefully neutral. "Not a question, an observation." The nurse frowned. "Did it?" "Yes." She hesitated just long enough. "Children tap things," she said. "They don't always remember." He nodded once. "Of course." He stepped aside to let her pass, but as she did, her gaze lingered on him with a trace of concern. Not suspicion, uncertainty. She was weighing whether she had been told to say something or not say anything at all. That uncertainty mattered. An hour later, the opportunity presented itself. The child was with her governess in a different wing, escorted by 2 guards. The nursery stood empty, cleared for routine airing. Cleaning staff were present but confined to the far side of the room. The guard entered with permission granted through standard procedure. He approached the side table where the iPad had been placed to charge. He did not touch it immediately. He checked the seal on the charging port, the orientation of the stand. Small things, all consistent. He lifted the device and activated it. The home screen appeared, icons arranged in their approved grid. No alerts, no messages. He navigated to the photo gallery. There were no recent additions at first glance. The last image timestamped 3 days earlier, an outdoor shot, benign, logged. He changed the sort order. A single thumbnail appeared at the bottom of the list. Timestamp 22:42. He tapped it. The image filled the screen without drama. No blur, no darkness. The clarity was what unsettled him. It showed the nursery corridor, angled low, as if held by someone shorter than an adult. The perspective was slightly tilted. In the foreground, the edge of a familiar foam crown lay on the carpet. In the midground, a pair of adult shoes, polished, formal, unmistakably not staff issue, stood just inside the open doorway. One hand entered the frame from above, fingers extended downward, close enough to suggest guidance rather than restraint. The face was not visible, the badge was not visible, but the corridor was unmistakable. He studied the metadata. The image had not been uploaded, not shared, not backed up. It existed only locally, taken then left. He locked the screen and stood very still. This was no longer a systems issue. It was a moment preserved unintentionally by a child who did not understand what was irregular, only that something had been there. The guard returned the iPad to its stand exactly as he had found it. He did not copy the image removing it too soon would be noticed. He needed the device to remain where it was, unchanged, until he chose the moment. As he left the room, he felt the pressure shift, not increase, clarify. The resistance he had sensed earlier now had shape. This image collapsed plausible explanations. It removed the comfort of ambiguity. Protocol provided a route for concerns involving devices. It did not provide one for confronting what this implied, especially when the implication pointed upward. He resumed his post outside the nursery wing, posture unchanged, expression unreadable. Staff passed him, voices echoed. Life continued. Inside his jacket, his notebook felt heavier than paper should. He now carried something that could not be explained away as technical error, something that would demand a response. The question was no longer whether to act. It was who would be forced to see it first. He waited until the afternoon cadence of the palace shifted again. Late day brought a different tempo, fewer visitors, tighter movement, senior figures transitioning between obligations. It was a time when small requests carried more weight, and refusals required clearer justification. The iPad remained on the side table where he had left it. A thin cable connected it to the wall, the battery indicator steady. He passed the doorway twice without entering, confirming no one else had disturbed it. When he did return, it was under the pretext of a routine device compliance check, signed out in advance, visible in the system. Transparency this time was protection. He closed the nursery door behind him and moved with deliberate care. The room was brighter now, sunlight angling through the curtains, dust motes suspended in the air. The quiet felt exposed rather than protective. He lifted the iPad again and navigated back to the photograph. He did not study it further. He already knew every detail. Instead, he initiated a forensic copy, bit for bit, time-stamped, preserving metadata and system logs. The process took less than a minute. When it finished, he verified the hash twice. He did not delete the original. He powered the device down and returned it to its place. As he left the room, he encountered the senior household officer from the night before. The man stopped, blocking the corridor just enough to be deliberate. "I'm told you've been very thorough today," the officer said. "Yes," the guard replied. The officer glanced past him toward the nursery door. "There's nothing further to find." The guard met his eyes. "That depends on what you consider further." A measured silence followed. The officer's expression did not harden. It softened instead, the way authority often did when it expected compliance. "You're trusted here," he said. "That trust goes both ways." The guard nodded once. "I understand." The officer stepped aside. "Good." The exchange ended without overt conflict. That was the point. Pressure inside the palace rarely announced itself. It assumed. The guard returned to his post and stood watch as the child was brought back later in the afternoon, laughing softly at something said by her governess. He did not look at her directly. He watched the space around her, the distance maintained, the hands that reached and withdrew. At 16:40, he received notice that Prince William would return from engagements earlier than scheduled. The information passed through the internal channel as routine. For the guard, it restructured the day. This was not an emergency. It was an opportunity. He reviewed the material once more in a secure room, ensuring the sequence was clean. Door logs, camera override data, badge access, and finally the photograph. Each element reinforced the next. Presented together, they told a story without commentary. He prepared no speech. When he returned to the corridor, the atmosphere had tightened. Staff moved with greater purpose. Security adjusted positions subtly. The palace was reorienting around a principal presence. The guard took his place along the route that led toward the private offices. He waited. When the moment came, it was brief. A pause in movement, an aide stepping aside, a clear line of approach. "Sir," the guard said, voice low, precise. "May I have a moment? It concerns last night." Prince William stopped, not immediately but fully. He looked at the guard, not impatient, not alarmed, attentive. The guard did not raise his voice. He did not gesture. He simply held out the device containing the image, screen dark, waiting to be activated. "There is something you need to see," he said. "Nothing more." The corridor seemed to narrow around them, sound receding as if the palace itself had leaned in. Prince William nodded once. "Show me." The guard activated the screen. The photograph appeared. He watched the prince's expression change, not dramatically but unmistakably. Attention sharpened. Stillness replaced movement. The moment lengthened. When Prince William looked up again, his voice was "See." "Entrold, who else has seen this?" "No one," the guard said, "until now." Another pause, this one heavier. "Come with me," the prince said. The guard followed, aware that the sequence had irrevocably advanced. The matter was no longer contained within corridors and systems. It had reached a threshold where silence was no longer an option. The room Prince William led him into was small, functional, and deliberately unadorned. It overlooked an internal courtyard where winter light pooled weakly on stone. The door closed behind them without ceremony. No aides followed. That, more than anything, signaled the seriousness of what had just occurred. Prince William did not sit immediately. He stood near the window, hands loosely clasped, eyes on the glass rather than the guard. "You're certain of the sequence," he said. It was not phrased as a question. "Yes, sir." "And this image," the prince continued, "has not been altered. It has been forensically copied only. The original remains on the device." Prince William nodded once. He turned, extended his hand, and the guard passed him the secure drive. The prince studied the photograph again, this time longer, zooming slightly, then returning it to full frame. His breathing remained even. "Who has tried to stop this from moving forward?" he asked. The guard answered carefully, "No one directly." "That wasn't what I asked." The guard held his posture. Senior household and technical staff have advised that the matter was resolved as a systems issue. Prince William exhaled through his nose, a controlled release. He set the device down. "Leave this with me," he said, "for now." "Yes, sir." The prince met his eyes. "You've done your duty by bringing it here. That doesn't mean you continue acting independently." The words were measured, reasonable. They carried the weight of command without threat. "I understand," the guard said. Prince William opened the door himself. Outside, the palace resumed its flow instantly. Voices returned. Footsteps overlapped. The private gravity of the room dissolved into public normalcy. The guard returned to his post. Within the hour, the counterpressure arrived. A formal message appeared on his device, summoning him to a routine debrief with the security director. The language was neutral. The timing was not. The director's office was larger, its walls lined with framed commendations and protocol charts. The man behind the desk had spent his career balancing protection with institutional stability. He gestured for the guard to sit. "I'm told you escalated a matter this afternoon," the director said. "Yes." "Without notifying this office first." The guard did not argue. "That is correct." The director folded his hands. "You understand why that's a problem?" "Yes." Silence stretched between them, not hostile, evaluative. "You've always been thorough," the director continued. "Reliable, that's why this concerns me." The guard waited. "There are ways to handle sensitive issues," the director said. "Ways that protect everyone involved, including the child." The guard met his gaze. "With respect, sir, silence does not protect." The director's expression tightened slightly. "It protects the institution that protects her." Another silence, this one sharper. "You've placed senior staff in a difficult position," the director said. "You've also placed yourself in one." The guard nodded once. "I accept that." The director leaned back. "Good. Then you'll accept this as well. You are to suspend any further independent inquiry. All materials are to be routed through this office. You will not discuss the matter outside authorized channels." The instruction was clear, reasonable, official. The guard felt the boundary close in. "Yes, sir," he said. He left the office with the weight of compliance settling over him like a coat he did not want to wear. By early evening, subtle changes had taken effect. His patrol route was adjusted, still near the nursery, but less proximate. Access privileges remained, but monitoring increased. He felt it in the way radios checked in more often, in the way conversations paused when he approached. No one accused him of wrongdoing. No one needed to. Protocol had begun to assert itself, not as guidance but as containment. He stood at his new position, watching the corridor where the nursery lay just out of sight. The child's laughter echoed faintly from another wing, distant but present. The photograph no longer belonged to him. The decision no longer belonged to him either. But the responsibility did. He waited, knowing that pressure would continue to build, not toward action but toward inaction. And that eventually, he would be asked to choose which one he could live with. By nightfall, the palace had adjusted around him. It wasn't overt. No one relieved him of duty. No one raised their voice. The changes were procedural, justified individually, difficult to challenge without appearing defensive. His radio checks were reroute. Ted threw an alternate supervisor. His access requests took longer to clear. A second guard was quietly assigned to adjacent posts during his shifts, not to assist, but to observe. He acknowledged each adjustment without comment. At 19:30, he received a written directive on his device. Formal. Logged. It reiterated the security director's instructions. All inquiries centralized, all materials sequestered, all communication restricted. The language was careful to frame this as protection, for the child, for staff, for the crown. Nowhere did it mention the image. He stood beneath a wall sconce where the light cast his shadow long and thin along the corridor. Staff passed him, eyes forward. A junior officer slowed briefly, as if to speak, then thought better of it and continued on. The guard noted it and let it go. Later, as the palace settled into its evening rhythm, the senior household officer approached again. This time there was no pretense of coincidence. "You've been instructed to step back," the officer said quietly. "Yes. And yet you're still here." "This is my assigned post." The officer nodded, accepting the technical truth while rejecting its spirit. "You understand how this looks." The guard did not answer. The officer lowered his voice further. "This situation will be handled. You've done enough, more than enough." The word enough hung between them, weighted with implication. Not gratitude, warning. "Understood," the guard said. The officer studied him for a moment, then moved on. The exchange would not be recorded. It didn't need to be. At 21:05, the nursery lights dimmed to night setting. The door sealed automatically. Camera indicators glowed steady red. Everything appeared correct. The guard checked his watch. Then deliberately he did nothing. That restraint was the hardest part. Instinct pressed forward, review logs, cross-check movements, anticipate explanations forming above his reach. But action now would be overt defiance. It would confirm the narrative beginning to take shape around him, that he was overreaching, emotional, unable to separate duty from suspicion. Instead, he waited. At 22:11, his radio buzzed with a brief message: "Stand down after midnight. Reduced coverage authorized." The order made sense on paper. Staffing optimization, risk assessment updated. In practice, it meant distance. He acknowledged the message. At 22:34, footsteps approached from the direction of the private offices. Prince William emerged with a single aide, moving more slowly than earlier, expression contained but alert. When he saw the guard, he stopped. The aide hesitated. Prince William raised a hand slightly. The aide stepped back. "You were told to let this move through channels," the prince said quietly. "Yes, sir." "And yet you're still positioned here." "Yes, sir." Prince William studied him for a long moment, not as a superior assessing compliance, but as someone measuring intent. "They will try to resolve this without disturbance," the prince said. "You understand why?" "Yes." "And you believe that is insufficient?" The guard did not answer immediately. He chose his words with care. "I believe unresolved exposure creates future risk." Prince William nodded once. "So do I." The admission was brief, controlled. It did not change the situation, yet. "You've been given lawful instructions," the prince continued. "I won't ask you to violate them." "I wouldn't expect you to." Another pause. This one carried something different, alignment without endorsement. Be precise, the prince said finally, and be patient. He turned to leave, then stopped. If you're wrong, this ends your career, he added without threat. Yes, sir. If you're right, the prince said, already moving away, it becomes much larger than that. The guard remained where he was long after the corridor emptied again. The conflict had narrowed to a single line. Comply fully and let others decide, or hold readiness for the moment when restraint would no longer be ethical. He had not crossed that line yet, but he could see it clearly now. The instruction to stand down after midnight was rescinded quietly, without explanation, at 23:58. The message arrived as a system update rather than a direct order, buried among routine notifications. The guard acknowledged it without reaction. He understood the language well enough to read what wasn't written. Something had shifted, but not enough to announce itself. Shortly after midnight, the palace entered its deepest quiet. Corridors emptied, doors sealed, the ambient sounds reduced to ventilation and the distant ticking of concealed clocks. He took up position near the private passage that connected the residential wing to the inner offices, a route used infrequently and never casually. At 00:17, Prince William appeared alone. No entourage, no aides. He wore a dark jacket rather than formal dress, the kind chosen for movement rather than presence. He slowed when he saw the guard, then stopped. Fully, eyes already alert. Walk with me, the prince said. They moved side by side through the passage, their footsteps measured, unhurried. The walls here were older stone worn smooth by generations. The lighting was minimal, deliberate. You've been told to let this go, Prince William said. Yes, sir. And you haven't. No, sir. The prince did not look at him. Why? The guard kept his gaze forward. Because the exposure has not been resolved, only contained. Prince William nodded once. Contained by people whose priority is stability. Yes. And yours? Safety. They stopped near a narrow alcove where a small table stood beneath a framed plan of the palace. The prince turned then, studying the guard with focused attention. Show me everything, he said. The guard removed the secure drive and connected it to the tablet the prince carried. He did not narrate. He let the sequence speak. Access logs first, then camera override data, then the badge audit. Finally, the photograph. The prince held the image longer this time. He enlarged it slightly, then returned it to full frame. His jaw tightened, not in anger but in calculation. This wasn't accidental, he said quietly. No, sir. And the child, the prince asked. Unharmed, the guard replied, at all observed points. Prince William exhaled, slow and controlled. That does not make this smaller. No, sir. The prince handed the tablet back. You understand what you're asking me to do? Yes. You're asking me to involve external authority, the prince said, which means relinquishing control. Yes. And once that happens, the prince continued, there is no discretion left, no internal resolution, no quiet correction. The guard nodded once. That is correct. Silence filled the alcove. Somewhere far above, a door closed softly. The palace breathed around them, unaware of the decision forming inside its walls. Prince William straightened. I need to be certain, he said, not of your intent, of your restraint. You haven't acted beyond what you can defend. I haven't, the guard said, and I won't. The prince held his gaze for a long moment, then reached into his pocket and removed his phone. He did not unlock it yet. If this moves forward, he said, there will be consequences for staff, for systems, for you. Yes, sir. And for me, the prince added. He unlocked the phone. The guard stood motionless as Prince William stepped a few paces away, turning his body slightly aside. He spoke quietly, precisely, using terms that indicated process rather than alarm. When he finished, he He ended the call without flourish. He turned back. "It's done," he said. The guard absorbed the words without visible reaction. The sequence had advanced beyond containment. "Remain at your post," the prince continued. "Say nothing unless asked, and understand this, what follows will not feel orderly." "Yes, sir." Prince William nodded once and moved away, his footsteps receding into the deeper quiet of the palace. The guard returned to his position, posture unchanged. Outside the walls, a different system had been set in motion. The guard remained where he was after the prince disappeared into the corridor, the air still carrying the faint trace of movement. The palace did not react to the call in any visible way. No alarms, no sudden footsteps. If anything, the silence deepened, as if the building had closed around itself. He checked his watch, 00:29. He resumed patrol at a measured pace, passing through the residential wing with the same neutrality he had maintained all night. The knowledge that external authority had been notified did not lessen his vigilance. It sharpened it. Once outside systems became involved, timing mattered more than speed. At 00:47, he noticed the first deviation. A security supervisor he did not recognize appeared near the service junction, standing with a tablet angled away from view. The man's posture was casual, but his attention was fixed on access points rather than people. Temporary assignment, the guard assessed, brought in quietly, not part of the normal rotation. At 01:03, two vehicles entered the inner courtyard through the secondary gate. They did not use sirens. Their arrival was masked as routine service access, logged under a generic authorization code. The guard watched from a distance as drivers remained inside, engines idling, waiting. He did not approach, he did not acknowledge them. Inside the palace, movement increased in subtle ways. Doors that were usually locked at night opened briefly, then closed again. Staff who should have been off duty appeared, faces set, speaking in low voices. The institution had begun to sense intrusion from outside its own hierarchy. At 01:21, the security director crossed the corridor, walking faster than usual, phone pressed to his ear. He did not look at the guard. That omission was deliberate. The guard's radio crackled once, then went silent again. No instructions, no corrections. He stood in place, eyes forward, hands steady. At 01:34, Prince William reappeared, this time accompanied by two individuals dressed plainly, their manner unmistakably official. They moved without haste but with purpose. The prince did not stop when he passed the guard. He did not need to. Their alignment had already been established. One of the men glanced briefly at the guard's insignia, then away. Recognition without engagement. The nursery wing was sealed within minutes, not locked down but isolated. Access permissions were frozen. Cameras were duplicated to an external feed. The shift was procedural but irreversible. The guard was instructed to remain at his post. The order came through a different channel than before. Clear, direct. It did not ask him to forget anything. He stood as the child was quietly relocated to another secured area, escorted by familiar staff to avoid distress. The process was careful, controlled. The child's voice carried once, confused, not frightened, then faded. The guard did not watch her go. He watched the hands of the adults around her, the distances maintained, the compliance now visible in every movement. At 02:10, the senior household officer emerged from a side corridor, face drawn tight. He stopped in front of the guard, no longer masking the strain. "You should have trusted the process," he said. The guard met his gaze. "I did." The officer shook his head once. "You've invited scrutiny that won't stop where you think it will." "I know," the guard replied. The officer stepped closer, lowering his voice. "This place survives on discretion." "So do children," the guard said evenly. The officer held his stare for a moment longer, then turned away without another word. The exchange was not a victory, it was an ending. By 02:45, statements were being taken in controlled rooms far from the nursery. Access logs were mirrored, devices collected. The photograph no longer stood alone. It was now one piece among many, contextualized, unavoidable. The guard remained at his post until dawn, posture unchanged, expression neutral. When light finally returned to the palace windows, it revealed nothing unusual to the outside world. Flags flew, schedules resumed. The appearance of continuity was flawless. Inside, lines had been crossed that could not be redrawn. The guard removed his gloves and flexed his fingers once, a small release of tension. He understood now that his role was shifting again, not toward resolution, but toward consequence. What he had done could no longer be undone. And what came next would test whether the system could correct itself, or only defend itself. By mid-morning, the palace had settled into a controlled version of normal. From the outside, nothing appeared disrupted. Staff entrances opened on schedule, courtyards were swept, flags moved gently in the wind. Inside, however, the atmosphere had shifted from discretion to caution. Conversations were shorter, doors closed more often than they opened. The guard was reassigned to a static position near the administrative corridor, neither promotion nor demotion, simply containment framed as necessity. He accepted it without comment. The location gave him limited visibility but excellent awareness. People passed through this corridor when they were required somewhere, not when they wished to be. At 10:42, the first external officers entered the building. They were not announced. No uniforms, no badges displayed openly. Two men and one woman, dressed in neutral professional attire, escorted by palace security but clearly not subordinate to it. Their movement was efficient, their expressions unreadable. They carried nothing visible except thin folders and phones secured in plain cases. The guard noted how palace security adjusted around them, slightly deferential, slightly defensive. A recalibration of hierarchy was taking place in real time. One of the officers paused briefly near the guard, eyes flicking to his insignia. A glance passed between them, not recognition exactly, more an acknowledgement of role, someone who had stood his ground. The officers continued on. Within minutes, the administrative corridor was sealed, access permissions updated, internal systems mirrored externally. The palace's ability to quietly resolve matters had been formally interrupted. At 11:15, the guard was summoned to a side room he had never used before, windowless, neutral, a table, 3 chairs, a recording device placed openly in the center. He entered alone. The external officer who had glanced at him earlier was already seated. The woman stood near the wall, tablet in hand. The second man remained by the door. "State your name and role," the seated officer said, voice even. The guard complied. "You understand this is an official statement," the officer continued. "You are not accused of wrongdoing." "Yes." The officer nodded. "We'll proceed chronologically." The guard spoke carefully, precisely. He described what he observed, what he believed, door position, camera status, absence of logs, the photograph, each detail delivered without emphasis, without interpretation. When he finished, the woman asked a single question. "Did anyone instruct you not to pursue this?" The guard paused only long enough to be accurate. "Yes." "Who?" "Senior household and security officials." She noted it without reaction. The seated officer leaned back slightly. "Did you violate protocol?" "Yes," the guard said, "in escalation sequence." "Why?" "Because delay increased risk." Another note, no judgment offered. The interview lasted 37 minutes, no raised voices, no reassurance. When it ended, the officer closed the folder. "You did what you thought was necessary," he said. That doesn't make it easy for anyone. I didn't expect it to, the guard replied. He was dismissed without ceremony. Back in the corridor, the palace felt smaller. The presence of external authority compressed everything: movement, speech, expectation. Staff avoided eye contact now, unsure which version of reality was safest. At 13:02, two senior staff members were escorted past him toward a secured room. Their faces were composed, but their shoulders were tight. The institution was beginning to experience consequences it could not redirect. The guard remained still. Pressure now moved in two directions: internally, toward minimizing damage; externally, toward establishing facts. He stood between those forces, no longer central but no longer invisible either. He understood this phase well. Once control was lost, systems often tried to reclaim it by isolating those who disrupted equilibrium. He waited, aware that the next pressure would not be subtle. It would be personal. The personal pressure arrived in the afternoon, precisely calibrated. At 14:18, the guard received notice that his presence was required by Human Resources and Internal Security jointly. The phrasing was neutral, procedural. It framed the meeting as welfare-oriented, routine after involvement in a high-sensitivity incident. The room they led him into was brighter than the interview space from the morning, deliberately so. Windows looked out onto a manicured lawn where gardeners worked uninterrupted, normalcy on display. Two people waited inside. One he recognized, an internal compliance officer he had dealt with before, efficient and careful with language. The other was unfamiliar, introduced only as an external liaison assigned to support institutional coordination. They invited him to sit. "This is not disciplinary," the compliance officer began, "at least not at this stage." The guard inclined his head slightly. He did not thank her. "You understand," she continued, "that when external authorities are involved, internal reviews run in parallel. That's standard." "Yes." The liaison leaned forward. "We want to ensure you're protected," he said. "Situations like this can be isolating." The guard said nothing. "You acted outside escalation protocol," the compliance officer said. "That creates exposure, not just for you, for others." "Exposure already existed," the guard replied evenly. She acknowledged the point with a small nod, then moved on. "Your access will remain limited until reviews conclude. That's not punitive, it's precautionary." "Understood." The liaison offered a thin smile. "You may also experience a change in how colleagues interact with you. That's unfortunate but common." The guard met his eyes. "I'm aware." They studied him for a moment, perhaps expecting frustration, defensiveness, something to document. When it didn't appear, the compliance officer closed her folder. "We'll contact you if further clarification is required," she said. The meeting ended without resolution. That, too, was deliberate. Back in the corridor, the guard noticed the shift immediately. Conversation stopped when he approached. A junior officer who normally greeted him now nodded stiffly and looked away. Someone had framed the narrative: cooperative but risky, principled but inconvenient. At 15:41, he was relieved from his post earlier than scheduled. Another guard took his place without comment. The instruction came from a supervisor who would not meet his eyes. He walked the long route out of the residential wing, boots echoing softly on stone. He felt the building watching him, not with hostility but with calculation. Institutions did not feel guilt. They felt imbalance. As he passed a side corridor, he caught sight of the child briefly, escorted between rooms by familiar staff. She was calm, distracted by conversation, unaware of the structures bending around her. The guard did not slow. He did not look twice. Protection sometimes meant absence. Outside, the air was cooler. He stood for a moment beneath the archway, adjusting his gloves out of habit, though his hands were steady. He understood now that his role had changed again. He was no longer acting to expose a risk. That phase was over. He was now evidence of what happened and of how the system responded when pressed. Whether the institution learned from that evidence or tried to erase it would determine what came next. He turned and walked back inside when his break ended, posture unchanged, expression neutral. External authority would continue its work methodically. Internally, the palace would test its defenses. And somewhere between those processes, the truth would either hold or be buried under procedure. The guard returned to duty the following morning under a different designation. Temporary reassignment, pending review. The phrase appeared on his device without explanation or apology. It altered nothing about his uniform and everything about his position. He was posted to the outer residential perimeter, a zone of low incident probability and high visibility. The assignment carried a message: remain present, remain correct, remain distant from anything still unfolding inside. He accepted it. The palace had entered a new phase, one that favored process over momentum. External officers moved in small, efficient units, never rushing, never lingering. Interviews continued behind closed doors. Devices were cataloged. Access hierarchies were mapped and remapped. The institution responded as it always did when pressure became unavoidable, by formalizing everything. From his post, the guard could see only fragments: a senior aide exiting an office with a fixed expression, a security manager speaking too carefully into a phone, the subtle absence of certain staff who had once moved freely through the corridors. No one spoke to him about outcomes. That omission was intentional. At 10:06, he was called briefly to confirm a detail from his statement. The interaction was precise, restrained, almost clinical. When it ended, he was thanked and dismissed. The gratitude carried no warmth. It did not need to. By midday, the palace had stabilized again. The visible disruption faded. Schedules resumed. Meetings took place in rooms that had been scrubbed clean of tension. To an outside observer, the system had absorbed the shock. Inside, consequences were still moving, quietly, selectively. The guard noticed the first clear sign just after lunch. A familiar senior figure crossed the courtyard accompanied by two external officers. No handcuffs, no raised voices, just proximity, the kind that indicated authority had shifted, at least temporarily. The figure did not look up. The guard did not react. Later, he was approached by a junior officer he trusted. The man stopped beside him, eyes forward, voice low. "They're saying you overstepped," the officer murmured. "They're also saying you were right." The guard nodded once. "Both can be true." The officer hesitated, then moved on. That evening, as light drained from the sky, the guard stood his watch and considered what remained of his role. He was still sworn to protect, still bound by protocol. But the structure he served had revealed its limits, how quickly it prioritized continuity, how reluctantly it confronted discomfort. None of that surprised him. He thought briefly of the photograph, not the image itself, but the fact that it existed at all. A moment preserved unintentionally, a child's instinct to record something that felt wrong without knowing why. The system had not noticed. One person had. At 1940, his device signaled the end of his shift. He acknowledged it and remained still until relieved. When he finally stepped away, the palace behind him glowed softly in the evening light, immaculate as ever. He knew the investigations would continue. Reports would be written. Decisions would be made at levels he would never see. His name would appear in some of them, sometimes as a footnote, sometimes as a complication. His career might narrow, it might stall. That was no longer the measure. He adjusted his gloves and walked on, posture straight, movements controlled. Duty did not end when a system corrected itself. It ended when the vulnerable were no longer asked to rely on chance. He would remain where he was needed, whether that place carried recognition or not. Night returned with a familiar discipline. The palace lights shifted to their evening configuration, softening edges, reducing depth. From the outer perimeter, the guard watched the rhythm settle again, doors closing in sequence, patrols aligning, radios lowering in volume. The system had regained its preferred posture, controlled, orderly, forward-facing. He stood where he had been placed, neither central nor peripheral. The position suited the institution. It also suited him. At 21:12, a message arrived from internal security requesting his availability the following morning. No urgency indicated. No explanation offered. He acknowledged it and locked the device. Availability was not obligation. It was leverage applied gently. He used the remaining hours of his shift to observe. Observation had always been his strength. He watched how certain routes were avoided now, how new faces appeared where familiar ones had been absent. Authority had not collapsed. It had redistributed itself, quietly and with intent. Shortly before midnight, a vehicle passed through the outer gate without stopping. Clearance pre-approved. He noted the time and the plate, not because he was required to, but because it had become habit to record what others assumed would go unnoticed. When his relief arrived, they exchanged the minimal words required: professional, correct. The guard left the perimeter and walked the long way back through the grounds, the gravel crunching softly underfoot. The air was colder now. Clean. He did not think about vindication. That concept belonged to narratives, not to systems. What mattered was outcome. The child would not remember the photograph as evidence. She might not remember the moment at all. That was as it should be. Memory was not a burden she needed to carry. The system would remember, though, even if it tried not to. Records had been created that could not be fully erased. Decisions had been made in rooms that would echo later when similar choices presented themselves. Institutions learned slowly, but they did learn, sometimes only after being forced. The guard reached the edge of the inner courtyard and paused. From here, he could see the windows of the residential wing, lights dim, silhouettes moving faintly behind curtains. Life continuing, shielded again. He turned away. In the days that followed, his role would likely diminish. Fewer sensitive assignments, more distance from the center. That was the cost of disruption. He accepted it without bitterness. Protection was not about proximity to power. It was about recognizing when power had failed, and acting before the failure became permanent. He left the grounds and stepped into the quiet beyond the walls, posture unchanged, pace steady. Tomorrow would bring further interviews, further reviews, perhaps further isolation. He would meet each one the same way he always had, with precision, restraint, and a refusal to look away. The palace would endure, it always did. But somewhere within it, a small irregularity had been noticed and answered. That was enough.